And our moderator for this panel this morning will be Khayshie, the wonderful Khayshie, who has the most beautiful first line of a bio ever. So Khayshie is a lawyer by trade, but a storyteller and educator by heart. I think that's so beautiful. She's a well-respected community leader and trusted advisor with almost 10 years of strategy and governance experience across local government, legal, leadership, housing, health, mental health, youth, gender equality and multicultural sectors. She's been everywhere doing everything. And I can think of no better person to lead this panel. Thanks, Khayshie.
Oh, so nice. I feel like I echo Maddie in that anytime anyone reads a bio, it's like someone wishing you happy birthday and singing it, and you're kind of like, where do I look as this happens? But thank you for letting me be here, and thank you for trusting me with a microphone. Whether you will regret that, we'll see. So my name's Khayshie. I'm very blessed to be your moderator for this panel on women's leadership and public participation. Last panel of the conference, bit of pressure. Following panel after Helen as moderator, that is like the worst pressure I can imagine. So bear with us as we go through this very, very important topic. And can I get a quick show of hands of who was here yesterday? Yeah, cool, awesome. So I don't know if you're feeling the same way as I did, but my head was so full yesterday that when I got home, I just like magnetically drew myself to the pillow and just conked out. There was so many stories shared. There was so many like heartwarming insights. And amongst all of these numbers and stats that made us think, the gender compass, for example, there were also these stories that created these aha moments. And I think those stories just mean so much, right? And when I was thinking about, what I would say today, I was thinking that I wanted to take a moment to reflect on the power of passing down knowledge through stories in this world that demands of us, numbers and business cases and justification, as if our stories aren't enough to do that. I think it's important to actually take a moment and draw strength and affirmation from First Nations cultures who have used storytelling and connection and coming together as community to pass down knowledge in such effective and important ways for generations and generations across millennia. And in that vein, I'd like to acknowledge that we're having this little chit-chat and conversation on Wurundjeri land today. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any First Nations people here today and online. So I adore being here, that's no secret. I have professional crushes on almost all of you, as I have listened to you chat around the networking spaces in between conference panels, but also listening to all of you who have graced this stage over the past 2 days. I think spaces like this are so rare, and the secret sauce of the feminist movement are these spaces. It is where we come together, where we connect, where you can take that sort of deep sigh of relief that everyone is kind of operating from the same grounds as what you are, and you have that shared language and connection. So, given that the secret sauce is conversations, I'm going to run this a bit like a talk show. We've seen some brilliant moderation, and I was so intimidated yesterday, but I figured I'd just take the mic and ask some questions. So, in that vein, I'm going to live out my dreams as a talk show host. We're going to spend about an hour chit-chatting about some questions, and I've had the absolute pleasure of meeting our panelists, and you are in for such a treat. Also keep your brains thinking, because I want to make sure we have some audience time as well for you to ask some of those really interesting questions, and I'm sure your brains will be buzzing as our panelists get some time to chat. So I'm going to try and keep it short, believe me. It's not out of altruism, it's out of professional nosiness, because I love asking questions. And I've had the pleasure of hearing from our panelists in some of the pre-panel sort of preparation bits. So, quick bio, which you've already heard. My name is Khayshie, my pronouns are she, her. I'm not going to do the whole bio thing, you've heard it. You can also look me up on LinkedIn if you're curious. The TLDR, too long didn't read version, is that I'm a lawyer by trade, but I'm very well known for doing anything but actually doing the law. I've been in a lot of different spaces, a lot of different sectors, and part of why I love forums like this is sometimes they tell my story better than what I can. So I'm going to share 2 insights that I got yesterday that should give you an idea of who I am and what I do. So one of them, and it was sort of referenced in the last panel about this human rights space being a block that we just chip at from a lot of different angles. That is my story. I've chipped at this block many different times, and someone I was speaking to yesterday said that if you're passionate about human rights, you find yourself on a bad day joining a lot of boards. That is also my life. If you catch me on a day where I'm angry enough, I will say yes to being a director. But the other thing that I think is really important is a conversation I had over dinner yesterday where someone said that after hearing my experience, they said, okay, so you're a translator. You translate I see you in the audience, hello. You translate systems and structures and power into ways that people understand, whether that's through education, whether that's through keynotes, moderation, corporate DEI, whatever you want to call it, on what flavour of the month it is. That's the stuff that I love to do. And what I love about these two explanations is that it proves this invisible string theory that I've had for a while, which is in the human rights space, we traverse different boundaries and different spaces. It seems random if you don't know much about human rights, but there is this secret thread that connects it all, right? So on that vein, I'm going to stop hogging the microphone, and I'm going to start asking our panel some questions, and I believe that we will have our other panellists pop up on the screen, if that's right. Soon? This is why the chair is free, the proverbial chair. So I'm going to start by throwing it to the panellists and ask a couple questions around, tell us a little bit about yourself. We are all professionally nosy and love to hear about the people behind the role. Tell us about the organisation that you're with and tell us what draws you to this work. And I might start by handing it to Christina first.
Great stuff. Thanks, Khayshie. Hi, everybody. Well, I'm Christina. I actually know a lot of the names on the call. It's great to see you all. Thanks for having me here. I'm sitting in the sunny window in Canberra because it's freezing. I'm Christina. I have spent decades working in gender and disability rights activism, and after realising that the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff wasn't working, I've segued across in recent years to leadership coaching and professional development, which is when I set up the Disability Leadership Institute. And so we're having our 8th birthday this week at the Institute, for short, the DLI. The DLI does a number of things. We do professional development, courses, training and coaching. We also have a large national network of disability leaders, so professionals and people developing their leadership space, because it was a gap. This country has not really put attention into the leadership of disabled people up until the DLI turned up, and it still has no national policy about doing anything about that. So here we are. We do our work, and of course, because of my background in gender and disability rights, we bring a rights-based approach to our work, and we also have not just a highly intersectional membership, but we are very conscious of what that looks like and how that pans out. So I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. Thanks, Khayshie.
Brilliant, thank you. I might throw to Asha.
Hello. Is this on? Yes, great. So my name is Asha. I am the founder and CEO of Girls Run the World, and we work to create opportunities for young women to engage with the diplomatic community, and it is all about creating access and opportunity for young women, primarily within diplomacy, but across a whole range of things, and showing them that higher level diplomats, ambassadors, people in senior roles are humans as well. They have the same problems as them. And it makes it so much easier to picture yourself in that role. And I think that when we're talking about political leadership and participation, that's one of the big things of not only seeing yourself in that role in terms of diversity and visibility, but also understanding that those people are human. And even when you look at the bios of everybody who has spoken, when you look at the bios of everybody who's in the room today or online, you are so impressed because everybody here is incredible and has done so much amazing work. But at the end of the day, we are also human. We have human problems. We have bad days. Some people don't know how to cook. Some people have trouble doing their laundry. But it's really exciting to be up here on this stage with some incredible leaders.
I feel quite personally victimised by the can't cook and can't do laundry comment, but we'll move on. Claire, how about you?
Hi everyone, my name's Claire and I'm here representing Women for Election. So Women for Election is a not-for-profit, politically agnostic organisation that is seeking to encourage more women to run for public office. Australia, unfortunately, is lagging behind in terms of representation across our 3 levels of government, even more so in terms of diversity of representation. So I'll set a goal for myself, for the audience for this panel, is I'm here because politics is really fun. And you might not think that, but actually politics is about representation and representing your community. And democracy is not a spectator sport. And when you look around the world, our democracy is fragile, and the health of our democracy is about who turns up.
Yeah, absolutely. James.
So my name's James. I'm here representing the Champions of Change coalition. So Champions of Change is a coalition of 260 CEOs or CEO equivalents. And our charter is to drive gender equality and in particular get far more women into leadership positions. I do this work because I think gender equality is Australia's growth edge. And if we look at the cost of living crisis, it's driven by lack of productivity. And if you look at the latest gender pay gap, it shows two things. Women are underpaid. The second thing it shows is that we underutilise women in Australian industry. The UN did a fantastic study. If we had gender equality, it would add around $3 trillion to the global economy. That's 3 times Australia's. So I do this because I think it's the most important thing we can do, and that's what Champions of Change is all about.
Yeah, awesome. You can tell why I had such a good time at the pre-panel discussion, hearing everyone. We're going to jump into the first question. Maybe it's I used to teach at a university level back in Bendigo, where I'm from. This might be the teacher in me, but I'm going to start with a definition question, which is demystifying some of these words that we hear a lot, namely the theme of this panel, which is women in leadership and public participation. I think one of my biggest gripes about the DEI space, but also gender equality movement sometimes, is that in the aim of being inclusive, we become so exclusive in our language that it's like a secret language we whisper between each other. So in the spirit of demystifying some of these concepts, anyone who wants to contribute, tell me, what does women in leadership mean to you, and what is public participation?
I'm going to kick
Go for
off.
it.
So I think the key thing about when people think about politics or running for public office, they have a very narrow view about you only win if you get elected. And so the key thing about Women for Election is that everyone that's involved in training and running the workshop, including myself, has run for public office. So I ran for the federal electorate of Khayshie in 2022 as a community independent. So I know what it feels like, what it looks like to run for public office. And I won because I participated. And so participating in our democratic processes is winning for our community, because every time a woman runs, a woman of colour runs, you change the conversation about what an elected representative looks like. And unfortunately in Australia, most people think of politicians as old white men. Sorry, James, you're sitting next to me. But effectively it is kind of, if you're just going to be honest, it is old white men that are politicians. And so a lot of people have this really strong bias that that's what a politician is. That's what they look like. And you have to be kind of that type of person to represent your community. And so for us, participation, entering the process, changes every single time it happens. A woman puts her hand up and says, I'm going to run for public office. It absolutely changes the conversation for your community. And for the next person, they say, oh, I look like her. Maybe that's a job I could do in the future. So participation is incredibly powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else want to comment? Asha, I see you've
I'm
lifted...
jump in there,
Oh, yeah?
Khayshie.
Yeah, go for it.
No,
Please.
I'm going to jump in there and just, for a start, for me, leadership is, when we talk about women in leadership, for me, women is also gender diverse folk, so women. So I want to be really clear about that. But something I'm really mindful, particularly from a disability perspective, is we just don't see people who are openly disabled in leadership in this country generally. And when we talk about it being women or then moving into gender diverse folk, it's even less likely. So, the previous panel I just caught the back end of, and, we toss around these words like intersectionality, and I thought there were some really good points made about that. But the reality is we're not kind of doing it. Leadership in this country still looks like older, mainly white people or apparently white people, and usually non-disabled folk. And so I think there's some sort of hesitancy or still a bit of discomfort or something going on. But when we talk about leadership in the disability community, one of the big things that we focus on, and I think growing up in the women's movement has also done this for me, that space where it's not just about positions and achieving positions of seniority. It's also about people getting out there and influencing their community, making change, shifting the ground, understanding that things need to be different and actually getting out there and doing it, making a difference, not sitting back and waiting for others to fix things, whatever things are. So for me, there's a big part about leadership being the people who take initiative, the people who jump in and actually get stuff done. And I think we do really well at that in the women's movement. You know, we're still learning about it in the disability community, but it's not reflected in who is then taking up those positions of responsibility and seniority in our community. So there's a bit of a dichotomy going on there.
Absolutely, and talk about women who are just getting in there and doing it. Asha.
I think building off of that, one of the building blocks for me is that the doors should be open, wide, and accessible. That's starting for public participation, getting those people in to then get them into those senior roles. Those doors should be wide open for everybody and should be able to include everybody. People with disabilities, people from all sorts of minorities should be able to enter the public space and enter that public participation arena from the get-go so that then we can have that flow-on effect.
And for me, in business, it means that women play an equal role in business. And by the way, business is male, pale, hopefully not stale. It means that women play an equal role in the business. And actually, that's numbers. And I'm a huge believer in setting proper targets, if not quotas. Around the boards I sit on, the boards are just better if you've got gender equality. In the companies that I've led and you go to the sites, when you've got gender equality, they're just better. And interestingly, we did some work in a business that I ran, Insitech Pivot, which is explosives. We were 20% better on every statistic when we had more gender balance, whether that be safety, customer service, productivity, cost, or revenue. So it's a pretty obvious equation we're dealing with.
Yeah, and I think that's a brilliant segue into this idea of like, it feels obvious. Like whenever I'm in this room, I'm like, we all get it. It feels obvious. What is so hard about this? And I think sometimes in creating, societal change, mindsets and assumptions are what we're up against the most. And they're pervasive, right? Like we've heard about gender norms, we've heard about gender stereotypes. The fact that I can, look at a 3-year-old and they also have an idea of gender already, I'm like, where did you learn this? Like, I had my first brush with racism when I was in year 2, I think. I was 5. What is a 5-year-old learning, the colour of your skin makes you want to vomit? Where did they get that from, Like, I saw some jaw drops, sorry. Probably should have content warning that. But yeah, that was my, first brush with this. I think, I've always been curious about what are these mindsets and attitudes that sort of lead to these spaces. And in the pre-panel briefing, there was a bit of an exciting discussion about what are these reframes of mindsets that, if we could have a superpower and change someone's mind tomorrow, what is actually going to catalyse this movement? So Claire, you sort of touched on a little bit around participation and the idea being the goal is not necessarily not winning, but the win is participation, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the political system is very much designed not encouraging people to enter. So we have a very sort of locked party system that has a whole lot of rules and structures and societal norms and assumptions about who should enter that system. Unfortunately, that system is not representative of the community. And 51% of Australia is female, the broadest definition of women, and so the system we've got doesn't actually represent the community that's designed to serve. And so what Women for Election is doing is we were very lucky to get a Commonwealth grant to run free workshops to effectively pull back the curtain about what is the role of a representative And how do you campaign? Because that's like a whole skill set about how do you actually set yourself up. You need a village, you can't do it by yourself. So how do you actually run a campaign? What are all the compliance with the Electoral Commission? And so our workshops, because of the grant, they're free for people, for women to register. They run all the way around the country. They can either be in person or online. You can just go to Women for Election and they're all there. But the key thing about them is actually to pull back that curtain and say, here's literally a to-do list. That's what, at the end of the workshop, women have, like, we're all good with a to-do list. You know, we just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And basically it says, this is, you just tick off one thing a week and you'll get there. And this is all the things so you don't get in trouble with the Electoral Commission, so you don't go bankrupt, you sort of set up your finances, you know, how do you do a flyer, how do you set up a website, you know, all the things that you need to be successful, and how do you organise your community to support you. So that's where Women for Election kind of are playing at the moment, to try and make it as accessible as possible. And the other thing I would say is that the narrative that politics is toxic is a narrative designed to keep us out. So when I decided to run for federal parliament, my parents-in-laws almost staged an intervention against me because they said, you know, you're gonna get divorced, you're putting your kids in danger, you know, why would you do this? And I'm a white privileged woman, and they were saying, like, no, it's got to be someone else. Why should it be you? And I was like, but I've got like lots of skills and I think I'd make a really good representative, and I want to offer something different to my community. So the bias and the assumptions are across all of society in terms of the who should represent their community. And I can categorically say it was like one of the hardest things I've ever done, but also one of the most joyous things I've ever done in my whole life. And my kids actually weren't in danger. And my son started to play mum bingo on the way to school to count how many times he saw my face between our house and his primary school. My eldest son actually, when I announced, his mates at high school said, "Isn't that your mum?" And he was like, "Nah, that's not my mum. She kind of looks like her, but that's not my mum." And then by the end of it, he was at the how to vote cards and saying, "That's my mum," and he was on social media. And at the end of it, they were like, "You got to do it again, mum. That was awesome." So yeah, you got to be careful about societal biases, and the kind of patriarchy is actually designed for us not to enter. And you've got to kind of watch yourself that you don't buy into that narrative.
Absolutely. And I think it goes to that saying that, you know, a lot of my generation, I find, say that they're not political. But the personal is political, right? Like, these are the systems that govern us. So how do we ensure that, like, I don't understand how people say they don't pay attention to politics, because it influences and infiltrates every single thing that we do.
Well,
So important.
Penny Wong famously has said, "You may never be interested in politics, but politics will always be interested in you."
Absolutely.
So, you know, everything all around you, education.
I want to add to that a little bit, Khayshie.
Yeah.
There's something interesting about, and it is patriarchy, you're right, Claire, well, in my opinion. There's something that happens, though, with minority groups, and we often talk about this amongst the DLI membership, about many of us are the first one of us to be in the room, or the only one who's in the room. Being in the room is critical. Participation is huge, and it's one of the big lessons I've learned along the way. But it would appear that we're welcome in the room, or we're okay to fight into the room, as long as we play by the rules that are already going on in there. So there's still this thing, the barrier, the big turn-off, if you want to call it that, and it relates a bit to what Claire was talking about, is if you're not playing by the rules of the room as they already exist, whatever that room is, then actually you're not welcome. And that's when we get the very high rates of bullying. Disabled people get 3 to 5 times the rates of bullying in the workplace as others, according to various studies. It's also when we find that, you know, we're there as long as your disability isn't too inconvenient or it doesn't, you know, show up. So those sorts of things. So it's a really interesting space around, you know, you can have the gumption, you can get yourself in there, you can be the first one or the only one, and it takes a hell of a lot to be doing that. And a lot of us in this room have been that first one. But when you're also actively discouraged from being in there or remaining in that room, when you're sidelined, when you're having the games played around, you know, how your idea is never the idea worth talking about in the board meeting until some old white bloke mentions it. Those things happen to us as well. These are the barriers that are created, and they're quite deliberate, quite specific, and they're structural. But I think we also need to be mindful of the fact that how you are and the privilege that you have or don't have that gets you into that space in the first place plays a very big role in whether or not you're welcome to stay there. And so you can fight your way in, but whether you're able to stay there is a very big question mark. And I think we're still very, very early in the piece. When it comes to gender equality, we are very early in the piece about who gets to actually stay in the room. Participating is winning, but if you're actively discouraged from participating and your participation isn't welcome, I think we've got some unpleasant truths to look at in that particular zone. Injecting a note of negativity there, which I'm not deliberately doing, but I think we need to be realistic here. We can't just dress this up as being a nice thing if we all just decide to jump in and have a go, because actually that doesn't work.
Yeah, absolutely. And Asha, I'm going to throw to you strategically in a minute. And I think, Christina, I absolutely echo that in terms of model minority. And, you know, if we play nice, we get to stay there. And there's a question later on about representation that I'm looking forward to around is all representation good representation, which is slightly spicy, but we'll get there. Asha, I really want to throw to you because you and I had a conversation, you know, earlier at morning tea around a particular mindset and a particular assumption, I guess, that's made that you think holds down a lot of young women in particular.
Firstly, I want to say, Christina, I 100% agree. And I think that we experience a similar phenomenon as young women walking into a boardroom where they kind of marvel at us. And they're like, oh, wow, you're so young. My grandson is single. This is so impressive. You've done so many things. You're how old again? And then you get to like actual conversations and they're like, that's nice, but we're going to wait until somebody else says it. And it is so incredibly frustrating. But Khayshie, back to your question, the conversation we were having earlier, and another thing that I'm quite frustrated in these circles is this feeling that we are constantly trying to fix women, and that we are giving them so many courses and training and having them tick so many boxes until they are able to be in the room. And then at the end of all of those training and courses, we're like, congrats, you get a certificate. Isn't this great? But we don't actually give them the opportunities to then use those skills, to then be on those boards, to then do those things, all of these things that they have learned. Whereas in reality, we don't need the training and the courses. We can be given the checklist of how to do it. We can be given okay, this is how you set up your finances, and then just go do it. I feel like we have lost this spirit of just go do it, and we are behind you to support you and help you. And I would really like to bring that back.
Absolutely. James?
Well, just to comment on that, it's a definition of craziness, isn't it, to try to train women to behave like men when you've got an organisation that's bloke's world, right? You definitely don't do that. What we recognise in Champions of Change, and what I recognised when I was CEO, was companies are designed to actually put men into some positions and women into others. And to the point that was made, the cultures are designed that when women come in, the culture will chase women out if they're not playing by the rules of what the stereotype says. So we recognise that in Champions of Change, you've got to recognise that's an immutable. And interestingly, when you see it, you can't unsee it, and what we do with our CEOs is to get them to go into the business and actually see it. And what we do is we've just developed a new tool which is called the 7 Switches, which is on our website, and it talks about how do you fundamentally redesign the organisation for equality from the ground up. Because unless you do that, organisations are designed to revert to type. And when you leave, the organisation reverts to type. So if I had my magic wand, I'd pull out the 7 switches and redesign our systems to building equality.
Yeah, I love that. And I think there's this I always love posing organisations questions. It's one of my favourite ways to create change. And the question I think that often goes to all of these points that all of you have mentioned is, who gets the privilege of learning by doing? And you will find that there's a lot of people where like the very idea of you getting into a role and not actually knowing and learning on the job is actually not afforded to everybody. There are some people who, I get advice from people sometimes who are like, Khayshie, just apply, just do it. Like, you can learn while you're there. And I'm like, I can't, because you carry this weight on your shoulder that if you fail, you don't know if they're just not gonna hire another young woman of colour again. So you carry these burdens that sort of come at you from all of these sort of different spaces. But I think it's absolutely what all of you have mentioned is this really interesting sort of side around mindsets. And I guess I'll say I wish you all had this proverbial magic wand, as you say. It'd be a much better place. And as foreshadowed, I'm going to move into a question about representation. So for me, growing up in regional Victoria, there weren't very many women of colour that I could look to in Bendigo who are in leadership positions. And I'd often hear, similar to what you said, Claire, around you can't be what you can't see. And I used to hate that phrase because I'm like, I don't have a choice. I don't see anyone. So it's not that you can't be what you can't see. It's that you can. It's just a heck of a lot harder. So I guess my question is to anyone in the panel who wants to sort of comment on it, is around representation in women in leadership. Any thoughts that you have on that? Is all representation good representation? Controversial, I know. And yeah, anyone who would like to kick us off? Anyone? Anyone? Pick up the mic.
No,
Look,
no, it's not.
Yeah, please.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
It's not, because something that we often get, and I think governments take a big, hefty part of the responsibility for this, but we see it a lot happening in the private sector as well, where there's the 2 or 3 people they know, and they consistently use the 2 or 3 people they know, and they're usually people who fit, that they're comfortable with, that they're prepared to have in the room with them because they play nice. But what it actually means is that it narrows quite substantially the representation, what it looks like. And so disabled women look like this, and it's a really narrow cast thing, and there might only be 1 or 2 particular disabled women that ever get to be seen in those particular places, that get all the appointments, that get the high profile stuff. It happens across all of the spaces, and we used to see it a lot a few decades back in the women's space when we were first getting women into some of these areas as well. And it's a big trap, because everything is based on networks when we're talking leadership, and the blokes really work on networks. It's their gig. And so if you're not in the networks that they know about, if they haven't heard of you, this of course is our merit-based appointment process, then you're not going to get a look in. If you're outside in government, for example, if you don't receive any government funding or you don't have engagement in government funding circles, you are not going to be somebody that they ever speak to. If you're not somebody that the corporates have heard of because you ended up on some news bulletin, if you don't have a high enough profile, then you don't get invited to the things that are potentially the change-making forums. So actually, representation can sometimes look incredibly narrow with only 1 or 2 examples of a particular minority group in them. So I think there's a big responsibility on the people, the in crowd, to be going outside their regular networks. One up for the CEOs, James, one for you to take away. Who haven't we looked at? Where are these people coming from? What is the network that we're tapping into all the time? Is it the same one we keep going back to? And, in that context, representation can get very dangerous, because when it looks narrow, it actually becomes a barrier in itself to new people joining in.
Yeah, representation is incredibly important, because in businesses it allows you to slay myths, right? Because the unwritten rule is, in the business I used to work in, is if you put a woman in a fertiliser shed, leading a fertiliser shed or an explosives in a pit, the sky's going to fall in. And of course, the reality is the sky doesn't fall in. And I think this is where you need to reframe your view of what leadership is, and that's what we did in Insight, because traditionally we confuse leadership with technical competence. And it's got nothing to do with technical competence. Leadership is about being able to teach the business system. It's being able to coach. It's being able to teach problem solving. It's being able to hold people accountable, which is actually defining their boundaries, giving them the resources and celebrating success. That's what leadership is. So when I was running Insitech, we started to experiment with this, and we hired a ex-bank manager to run our largest fertiliser shed in Townsville. So this was a fertiliser shed, one of the largest in the world. It had about 6 million tonnes go through it. And Catherine didn't know a lot about sheds, but she was an outstanding leader. Once again, the rule of 20 applied. We ended up with a 20% improvement in safety, 20% improvement in productivity, 20% improvement in cost. And as a CEO, I just grabbed onto that because the sky didn't fall in. In fact, we had the most engaged bunch of people, bunch of blokes working for a woman who ran a bank, operating a fertiliser shed. And I grabbed onto that and said, that's an example of what good looks like. That was the platform where the largest explosives factory in the world was run by a woman, the largest coal pit was run by a woman, and where we had 50% of the people on site being women. And critical mass is really important. So women leaders are really important because it allows you to get the critical mass going. And of course, once you achieve critical mass, the more you do, the more you'll do. So that's why it's just so important that we see women in leadership positions.
Yeah.
Plus, it's just good business, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was just probably picking up on some of the points made is the role of community leadership. And every single person in your community that volunteers or turns up is a community leader. There's someone that wants to volunteer and wants to work towards solving a problem or an issue in their community. And the key thing around women seeking or running for public office is, I mentioned it before, you actually need a village and you need a team of people and community leaders that, you know, for a whole lot of women, they feel uncomfortable or unable to run for public office themselves. But actually, we encourage people to come to our workshops that want to help another woman get elected, so they want to be part of their village. And so I guess in terms of the concept of representation, it's also around broadening our understanding of who is a leader. So there is hundreds and thousands of community leaders in every community that stand up and volunteer their time and expertise. In my campaign team, none of us had ever been part of a political party. We'd never run a campaign. We frankly had no idea what we were doing. But we all believed in the purpose of what we were trying to do. And we did an amazing 10-week campaign, and we all learnt a phenomenal amount of skills about how to set up websites and do fundraising and logistics management and all sorts of amazing skills that we've all actually taken into our next careers and our other jobs. So they're all kind of, it's like a professional development exercise, you know, doing this. So picking up on I think it was Christine's point is, the key thing about when you open the door and women come in, it's you've got to have that village with you for continuing. And so the village has to stay with you to support you to be successful. And the key thing we've seen in public office is that the first woman to get elected at a local council that's been 100% male councillors for 50 years has a really hard gig, like really, really tough job. But when there's 2 women, it's a bit easier. When there's 3, and then when you finally get equity. So equity is momentum. You can't ever stop. You've got to keep going in terms of the momentum. And that's where the role of the community leaders is incredibly important to sort of stay the course and continue to build on what you've achieved. Because you can't just say, oh, we've got 1 woman in and just stop.
Yeah.
I think this idea of community and conversation and open communication is so important. And even if the person at the table does not have the lived experience, they need to have the understanding and the awareness and the know-how of how to consult and talk with those people and then bring them to the table. And I think that good representation and good leadership is the people who have that understanding that they don't know everything and are able to then ask, okay, who do I need to talk to? Where do I need to go? How do I need to give these people resources to then bring them to the table as well and make that table bigger?
Absolutely, and I think...
I want to add to that actually.
Yeah,
Can I
go
just
for
add
it.
to that a bit, Khayshie, because
Yeah.
something, catching the end of the previous panel, which I found really riveting. There's been a particular push in the disability space to bastardise the term lived experience. You know, this happened to the term mainstreaming way back in the 90s when, suddenly we didn't want to talk about gender at all. But the concept of lived experience has come to mean anybody who once met a disabled person in the disability community. So we need to be mindful of this. But what it actually does is it acts as another barrier to the actual people of experience being in the room. And as the last panel was saying, and I missed her name, I think it was Virginia, but it might not have been, we need to be very, very careful about speaking for others. I think one of our roles as people who have any power, if we're those people, is to say, well, why can't we find somebody from that particular space, that particular community, that particular minority group? Why are we speaking for people instead of asking them to speak for themselves? We do it a lot. It's a very arrogant white thing in my experience, coming from a privileged white background. And I think we need to be really, really mindful of not doing this if we're talking about representation. And so it's particularly something when we get into the intersectional spaces. So, it's not just something to have a woman in the room. We need to have women of intersectional backgrounds. We need to have women of multiple spaces. We need to have women who understand those experiences. I cannot speak for queer folk. I cannot speak for First Nations women, sisters, but I can talk to you about disability. But I often find there are people who think they can talk about disability who are not a disabled person, and I find that particularly offensive, and I think it's one way we silence diverse voices and one way we actually minimise the achievement of equality, to be frank.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you've read my mind, Christina, because I was going to say essentially that, which is I read this article recently that was about, it was in response to diversity, equity, inclusion as DEI, and there's some privileged upper echelon people, who I will not name, who have created their own term called MEI, which is merit, excellence and intelligence, or something like that. And it's supposed to be this competitor to this idea of diversity, equity, inclusion and representation. And I think what's ironic in this whole debate, and my time in the DEI sector has been fascinating, let me tell you that. But it's kicking over this rock of essentially we want the same thing. We want the best people in the roles. And in this current system and structure, you are not getting the best people in the roles. And we're just trying to give those people the widest opportunity to participate. Because then if you have these longer lists that actually have everyone on there, you will find that some of the people you put in these roles actually aren't the best people at all. And I think that's, I guess my magic wand of if I could change someone's mind, it would be seeing that we're all trying to aim to the same thing, which is putting the right people in the right jobs and the right people in the right places. It's just that there are structural and systemic inequalities that are preventing that from happening. And Christina, you sort of bring me to my next question, which I feel like it's almost like I sent you a list of questions. Which is about...
Are you making an assumption I had time to read them, Khayshie?
Oh, that's fine. It's all good. You've just read my mind then, it's fine. Which is about barriers. And I think at the pre-panel discussion, Christina, you in particular had a really fantastic answer around this. It's one thing to build an initiative and ask people to come to it and do the shoulder shrug of the people who were diverse just didn't come. They just weren't there. I don't know what to do. And we had this really fantastic discussion around what are the systemic barriers that people maybe don't see or there needs to be a heightened awareness of that prevent all women and gender diverse folk from actually accessing leadership. And Christina, can you give us some thoughts on that?
Oh, look, straight up in the disability community, half of us don't work. Half of us are living on the pension or in some sort of poverty situation. And those of us who do work are often in lower paid or part-time positions, which means our means are more modest. It costs money to be in rooms of power. And so if you can't buy your way in, you're automatically at a disadvantage. If you can't get to, I'm not with you today, if you can't get to things, and that's not necessarily about affording a plane ticket, it might be, do you have a support person? Do you actually have the need to be there? So there's a cost barrier that's definitely a thing. There's something more about it. When you get there and you discover that, you know, I can't actually be in the room, I have to sit out here on the, you know, I've had colleagues who've gone to conferences to be keynote speakers as long as they can enter via the back alley and end up going through the kitchen to get to the stage. A conference I spoke at a couple of weeks ago, I ended up having the most circuitous route to even get up onto the stage to be able to participate. And there's just an assumption that this will happen, that it's a thing. But every time you do that, it's an extra layer of barrier, of discouragement, but also of exhaustion. So we're actually working harder. We have to check before we can be in the room. We have to find out if it's possible to be there. Will it be accessible enough? Will somebody have taken care of all of my needs? Am I actually able to be there on the terms that make me able to participate in a way that is up to my level? Or am I being limited by other people's failure to put the various measures in place? And then there's the cultural stuff, you know, when people use language that's really offensive or really off-putting. And just as, you know, we all understand about sexist language and misogyny, you know, and, you know, this appalling racism that we live with that's ever present, we have an appalling level of constant ableism coming our way. People just assume that the words that they're using are funny or amusing, when in fact they might be highly offensive to disabled people. So Australia's full of this. Our colloquialisms are dreadful. So there's a number of things that actually act as extra layers of barrier, as really off-putting things about participating. And we're supposed to laugh and shrug them off and just say, oh yes. But when you're doing that all day, every day, when you're the first one or the only one, or you're the first one, as you were saying before, Khayshie, you're battling to be the first one to get into the space, it's actually exhausting. And so people just turn away. They move away from the process. They give up. And I think that's really sad. As Claire was saying, participation is the key. But when the barriers to actually being in the room, to participating, are so ever present and sometimes incredibly in your face, we're still at a position where that's what we're dealing with for a large number of women and gender diverse folk. It's not all sweetness and light and just a matter of deciding to get out there and be involved.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to comment on barriers?
I think a really significant barrier that you touched on, especially for young people, is cost. And the cost to participate in some of these things. How many people here have been to CSW in New York? Yeah, did that almost bankrupt you? Like 2 weeks of accommodation in New York City, plus flights, plus eating anything other than $1 slice pizza. Like it is so preventative for anybody, for any young person to be able to go there without a trust fund. And you see that time and time again. So the AICD board director's course costs so many thousands of dollars. There are so many different things that you have to pay for to go to, flights, accommodation, just general costs. And it's really hard. It's really hard as a young person who's thinking about buying a house in their 50s to go to and participate in these things.
Yeah, I'd say that the three big barriers for women in public offices, one is I've mentioned the whole system's designed for you not to enter, so that's kind of the systemic issue, and that's true for the parties and also for independents. The second big thing is cost. Many of you may know Monique Ryan, who won the electoral of Kooyong here in Victoria. Her campaign cost $2.5 million. My campaign was cheap. Mine cost $100,000, my campaign. But interestingly, the average donation in my campaign was $20. So that's the other part of community leadership and support in the village, is that lots of $20 can actually make a big difference in terms of running a campaign. That also indicates another structural issue with the system in terms of the amount of money to actually even enter the system. On the flip side, you can pay $200 and put your hand up to be a candidate at local government, to be a councillor. So you actually can do it very cheaply as well. So federal parliament's the most expensive one to enter. So cost is a significant barrier. The other thing is also, the third one I'd say is that, and which is what Women for Election work really hard at, is there's a complete misunderstanding about what the job of a political representative is. So people think that you have to be a chartered accountant or a lawyer, or I had a young woman the other day say to me, oh, my uncle told me that this is a job you do when you've had a career and you retire. But actually, at the essence, a really good representative, the number one skill you have to have is an ability to listen. But even more than that, an ability to listen to understand. So to truly listen to people about the challenge they've had and their experiences. And the other big one is an ability to read expert advice, is actually to seek out other opinions, and because none of us are experts at everything, and actually to engage with people and say, well, this is a tricky issue, what would you do, what do you recommend, and to listen to experts and evidence and science about what would be a way. So they're the two key skills, an ability to listen, an ability to read, and probably the third one is advocate, so to advocate on behalf of your community. So again, to James's comment, there's no long list of technical skills you need to be a really fantastic representative.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the barriers we're working on in Champions of Change is, number one, care, because care, I would guess, would fall to the people in this room, not to myself. So we're redesigning how work is done in our organisations to accommodate care. For example, what's the magic rule that shifts should be 6 to 6? That means no one can drop off for kids. If you can change that till 9 to 9, or if you can job share, it means you can accommodate care with your work. We've done a big piece on what flex on the front line looks like for shift-based employees, and guess what? Even if you're on a shift, some of your work you can do at home. So rethinking what that looks like. And then there's physical barriers. If you look at industrial workplaces, they're designed for blokes. But actually, if it's too heavy for a woman, it's too heavy for a man. So using air to lift things, redesigning trucks so you don't fall out of them. It's good for men also. And that's the point on this stuff. Sometimes we think this is just all for women. Actually, a lot of it's for men, because who said that caring's not an important thing for a man? And so the conversation we're having is, this isn't just about accommodating women. This is about being able to bring our whole selves to work, and that means you accommodate caring. That means you make sure it's a safe place. And if you can change the narrative, then suddenly we can start to bring the whole of our workplaces along. Interestingly, if you talk to Scott White, Scott runs Viva, the Geelong refinery. 30% of the people in that control room are now women, because he started to accommodate care. And as it turns out, they tend to be all ex-nurses, because what's in common with nurses? They have a very high orientation for health and safety, they understand process, and they work shifts. So he's been able to find, and also they're so poorly paid, if you double their salary, they'll join an oil refinery. So we're starting to rethink through this stuff. Going back to where do you solve these problems, there's a concept that we've got, which is to solve the problems at the right level. And that is where it's experienced. And that was the comment on disability. If you want to make your place one that is friendly for disabled people, actually go to the disabled people in your organisation and get them to redesign it and take advice from that. And there's something in Champions of Change which we call listen and learn, which is go to the real place, seek the advice, and then empower those who are experiencing everyday sexism to design how you'd chase that at organisations. So that's pretty key to the work we're doing.
I think building off that, another barrier we have is we don't have enough spaces for collaborative and constructive conversations. This is a glorious space. Nobody has to shout over each other. Nobody is expected to be the loudest in the room to be listened to. We don't have this cacophony of voices or people standing up during question time to give like a 10-minute treatise on why the panelists are wrong. We don't have this hostility here. Everybody is here to listen and to be constructive and to build on each other's work. And we don't have enough spaces like this, so that when we do get to spaces where we are, you know, the token fighting for the thing that we are fighting for, we are pitted against everybody else fighting for their thing that is equally important, but we have to shout to be the loudest in the room. And it is so demoralizing, and it is so tiring, and it is so lovely to have spaces like these. And I think that if we could have more spaces like these, we could do so much more.
Absolutely, and I feel like that's the thing, is the phrase that I've noticed that's notably absent from this room is devil's advocate. And I saw this cartoon that's like, the devil doesn't need more advocates. Like, what? He's fine. He's all right. And I think that is exactly this, and I think something that all of your answers have touched upon, and you know, Virginia sort of got to this with this whole question about intersectionality, and I could talk about intersectionality for hours. Take me up on it, I dare you. Is that something that sort of pervades all of this stuff is class, right? So like, James, when you're talking about flexibility on the front lines, I love that, because most corporate DEI initiatives are about people in offices. Yes. It's not necessarily about operations, and what does that look like, right? When we talk about CSW, I remember that I was sitting in a side event where this incredible Maori organisation was talking, and they said so much useful stuff, go figure. Someone from the audience got up and said, "This is amazing. You should come to the Indigenous Forum, blah, blah, blah." And the person who was speaking was incredible, and they were like, or you could just pass on the message, because we can't afford this twice. Like you can't afford, we can't afford to then come and relay this exact same message at the forum, but if you're going to be at that one, just like pass it on, you know, that's fine. And, you know, even the other thing with CSW aside from costs is visas. You know, with it being held in New York, like in terms of this being the fundamental conversation of where, you know, women's rights are progressing, there's such barriers to actually getting there. And don't even get me started on the accessibility challenges of hotels in New York, it's tricky. But what I'm going to do now is, it's been such a fruitful conversation. I'm going to wrap us up on a final question, and it gets at, Asha, what you were saying around this is such a special space. And I think I was trying to think really deeply about how we wrap up this panel, and I think that this is such a collaborative space too, and that's the magic. So the question I'm going to ask is, before we move to questions in the room, so you will get your chance, I will put this mic down, is what can your organisation do for the people in this room, or your movement or initiative? But then also, what can this room do for you? How do we actually intentionally start that practical sharing? And if anyone wants to start, let me know.
Sure, I'm happy
Go,
to take
Asha.
that one. In terms of what I can do for you, I have energy. At the moment, I have time, and those feel like two very rare things in this room. I'm landing back in Canberra tonight, and I'm happy to help, I think is my big thing. I'm always happy to be there for a coffee, to lend an ear, to connect you with more people. If you ever see me on LinkedIn and realize that I have a connection you want, always happy to help. In terms of what this room can do for me, kind of the same thing. I am about to start working on a couple of really big projects concerning young women's access and helping young women get more opportunities, particularly in sharing their voices in the defense space, which I know is a very interesting space to be in. But also, as we've been talking about CSW, I would love to try and get more young women to CSW. So if anybody wants to help me with that or has money, let me know. But yeah, I think that's me.
I'm going to kick off by saying what everyone in this room can do, I guess, is to spread the word about Women for Election exists, that there are free workshops available. Anyone interested in government and democracy, it's a fantastic, it's a one-day workshop or two days online, 2 half-days online. So that would be fantastic. But actually, more importantly, is I'm going to ask everyone in the room, talk to your friends and families about politics. It's actually not a dirty word. It's actually something that we need to debunk, like actually sort of ask people what's important to them and how they can get more actively involved. And I think one of my phrases for my campaign was, I was sitting in my lounge room yelling at the TV, and at a certain point you just got to stand up and get involved. And so if you're not happy with where this country's going and what's happening, you got to stand up and get involved.
Absolutely. Christina.
And you can connect with me on LinkedIn if you want to. That's what I can
Overall.
do with you.
It's always about LinkedIn, yes. There's a couple of things. Firstly, what we can do for the people in the room. The Disability Leadership Institute is the largest professional network of disability leaders in the country. In fact, pretty much the only one that operates as it does. We're not an advocacy organisation. We're there to support each other and do stuff, but what we actually are is also the place to find people, so we can help you find the people that you are looking for. Right across the field, we've got astronauts, we've got fashion designers, we've got lawyers and academics, we've got the lot. So if you're looking for people, you can come to us. There's no excuse for not having disability leaders in the room. And that is kind of the other side of the coin to what the room can do for us, is look at the room you're in. How diverse is it? Who's in the room? Now, okay, you can't always tell disability by looking, so you need to be really mindful of that. Let's just get into some prejudice. Over 80% of us you cannot tell by looking. But if you do not know that disability is present in the room, find out. If it's not there, why isn't it there? Everyone needs to be asking the question. And for people who are in a room and they have power in that room, they have a responsibility to be asking that question. And that's an awful lot of people who are in this room today. And I particularly target the champions in that space, the champions of change, but that's why we actually engage with the champions on an ongoing basis, and we've been doing that since the outset. It's up to you to be asking who's in this room and who's missing. Not just assume that people will come to you and fight to be in your room, because they won't.
Well, the first thing that I notice is I'm the only man in the room, and that is something on men's backs. Right, sorry. So you're one, okay. So there's 2 of us, right? Yeah, so the representation's about 3%, right? So, the first thing that men need to do is start to stand up beside women, and it's not because you're not capable of having a voice. You are absolutely capable. But 2 things, it's exhausting, right? And actually sometimes it's easier for a man to call out another man. And secondly, actually, men have the power. We own the business systems. So if we really want to drive change and drive it quickly, it's absolutely vital we stand up and actually redesign our organisations for good for all of us, because organisations are just fundamentally better if they're diverse. What you could do for me is I sit on a bunch of boards, and we often get told rubbish by leadership. When you fill out your climate surveys, please write exactly what is actually occurring in terms of the inclusion and diversity programs, because it's really difficult to change and hold management accountable to change if you don't have the data. And, I've got to tell you, boards are fair income about this stuff because we see the benefit. So if you can, I know you say this often, and I know you've tried, next time you get another one, have another go. The verbatims come to boards now because we insist we get them and we can take action. So use your climate surveys.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I want to say a massive thank you, firstly, to our panellists for indulging my talk show fantasies. I cannot I can't do the Oprah thing. I can't tell you there's like, you know, you win a car and that's under your chair. Can't do that. But I can gift you with insights and, you know, the opinions of these incredible people. So first of all, let's get a round of applause for the panel. Second of all, I want to say a massive, massive thank you to all of you for being such an attentive audience. I'm hoping you have some questions prepared. But before we get on to that, I also want to say a massive, massive shout out to ERA and specifically to Helen. Helen took me under her wing at my first CSW last year and adopted me. And then I was on the government delegation to CSW this year, and I think it was a true testament to what women's leadership is and how it doesn't need to be per se technical formal positions. It's the role that you choose to take, and it is, you know, what some of the panelists yesterday were saying, which is, you know, what's the legacy you want to leave, what's the ancestor you want to be. And I just think that, Helen, you have left such a legacy, and, you know, round of applause again. All right, shall we crack onto some questions? Rachel, you were prepared. The email was not, you weren't preoccupied by an email. Huzzah, huzzah. All right, first question.
Hi, I have a question for James. My name's Marie. I'm just curious as to why you think there are no other champions of change here, but more importantly, how do we engage them and how do we get them to attend the next conference that we are?
Yeah, look, firstly, there was someone from Champions of Change yesterday. Annika came, and she's far better than me. But look, actually, it's really for men to call out other men, to be honest, and say, why aren't you here? And it's some of the reasons why we're going en masse to CSW, because once again, once you see this, you can't unsee it. And that's why it's so vital for men to get off their backsides and go and see your world, because we've got, in a lot of cases, the power to change it. So really, it's calling out other men. And I've got to tell you, in terms of my Champions of Change, we're based in the groups. I throw men off of the group if they're not feeding them. And we slaughter them. But it's really to engage them. This is a really safe space. I don't understand why more men don't come. And boy, I wish I had come 30 minutes earlier, because I've learned a lot more about intersectionality than I knew. So, yeah.
Yeah, awesome. And just in terms of picking up the back end of that question, how does the room get in touch with Champions of Change?
Oh, well, you just you can just email us, basically, or you can, for me, you can LinkedIn me. I'm really keen to learn and try to make a difference. So look me up on LinkedIn and share an invite.
Awesome. Any other questions? Oh, Rach.
Hi there, my name's Carolyn. I've got a question for you to do with leadership styles. But first, if I can, I just wanted to start with a really quick story. A friend of mine at her 50th birthday did her own speech, and she did a presentation called Reasons Why I Can't Be Prime Minister. And it was actually really hilarious, and it came with a PowerPoint presentation, and it was effectively all the edgy things she'd done in her life that the press would seize upon and stop her from being Prime Minister. Ever since I saw that, I've been really thinking about how great it would be if she was Prime Minister, and all those things that she presented would only make her a better Prime Minister. And so my question really is about leadership styles and whether you've got any thoughts or tips about once you do get there and you have a different kind of leadership that is based more on empathy, listening and elevating other people's voices, how you kind of infiltrate that amongst the other leaders around you and maybe get them to change that way as well.
On that one.
You go.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you go.
We actually talk about this a lot at the DLI, because we're obsessed with somehow bringing our disability into our leadership style. So not hiding it or burying it or masking it, but acknowledging it as front and centre. And that crosses across all the intersectional spaces that are very much a part of our community. And so that's about recognising that we have cultural obligations, that we have flexibility requirements, that we operate as human beings rather than pretending that we're not, that we're machines that operate 100 hours a week, because nobody should be doing that. So we've got this sort of build, but it's interesting because then when you bring that into the room, everybody else is doing the 100 hours a week, otherwise you can't be a leader trope, and actually gets rid of it in the same way that your friend was talking about, you know, if because of all these things I can't be Prime Minister. When in fact, don't we want leaders who actually operate differently, who see things differently, and through that bring both empathy, understanding, difference, an ability to listen more widely into the room. So I think, you know, there's some things that are going on that are fascinating to me in that that very new field of disability leadership and what it looks like, about how do we bring ourselves into the space so that we're not hiding who we are. And the only way I think we can do it is literally to build the diversity, to get the critical mass. We all know about critical mass, we've been talking about it for decades, but until we start shifting it, until we get in those rooms and then start making them our own and actually operating differently, I don't think it's going to shift. We're going to stick with the white bloke model of, you know, the 500 or 600 years that we've been using it. Nobody here's mentioned yet the 4-day working week, which for me is a game changer. I think we need to be starting to talk about these things. It's doing it differently. I don't use the word authentic as a leadership coach. It just makes me want to vomit. But it's, you know, being yourself is actually about owning who you are, recognising that, you know, you need to have breaks, that you need to have downtime, that you have responsibilities, that you also have off days, as Asha was saying at the beginning. And it's okay. How is that not okay?
Yeah, I'll just add to that in terms of, look, we've all probably got something in our life story that we are fearful could be weaponised if you went into a more public role, and you know, but do you honestly believe that everyone that is elected to public office doesn't have something in their backstory that they don't want to get weaponised? So again, this is a narrative to stop women from entering. And the key part of it is, you know, you just got to own your own life. Fiona Patton came out, is very proud that she's got a, you know, she used to be a sex worker, you know, she owned it. Jackie Lambie is very open about some of the trauma and experiences of her life and her son and her marriage. You know, actually, the more we talk about the struggles of our lives and things that have happened to us, none of us are perfect human beings, the more we normalise that actually that's what reality is. Life is messy, you know, and life is complicated and complex. And so there is this weird assumption that you don't want to enter because you're worried about, you know, things being weaponised, on the assumption that everyone's there has had somehow lived a perfect life without any scandals. The other thing I would say is there is incredible power about women backing each other in. So one of the big things in local government that was introduced to support more women to enter was to have access to childcare arrangements for young women to become counsellors. Unfortunately, that initiative is weaponised by male counsellors because it's publicly reported that a certain female counsellor has spent $10,000 on childcare to enable her to go to attend council meetings. More recently, I've seen this happen in Bass Coast Shire and in Gippsland Shire, when the local paper runs a scare story, there is a whole suite of women that do letters to the editor, that go on social media, that basically say this is ridiculous, childcare is for all genders, and it's to support more representation and more inclusion of people across all age ranges to become counsellors. So it's incredibly powerful when we back each other in, when we call out when this sort of stuff happens.
On leadership styles in particular, I work with an organisation called the Girls Leadership Network, and we do leadership workshops for young women aged 16 to 21. So like year 11 and 12, and then first couple years of university. And one of the things that we focus on in those first few sessions is leadership types, and that there are different ways of being a leader. And it is revelatory for these girls who have been taught that in order to be a leader, you need to be school captain. You need to do these, you need to be leading from the front. As soon as we're like, actually, you can lead from the side, the middle, the back. You can be quiet. You don't have to be loud. You don't have to wear a power suit. You can be shy and empathetic and not have any of those very traditional masculine blokey qualities. and still be a really good leader. They're like, okay, yeah, I want to do that. It's fabulous.
Well, fortunately, the really blokey leaders blew their companies up and they no longer exist. Exhibit 1, Jack Welch from GE, that doesn't really exist, and you can go through them. So I think we're starting to learn that actually doesn't work, and the more that we can point that out, and the fact that it doesn't work is really important. You just got to bring your true self to work. The gift of diversity is when people bring their true self to work. And it's why actually helping our leaders to be inclusive is so important, because that's what allows you to bear that out and make it safe to bear it out. So, you know, organisations have got a really good bullshit factor. They can smell it from 100 metres. So, you know, people are expected to see your true self. And being vulnerable, every time I've done that, gee, you score far more points, because, you know, it's true about people in glass houses, right?
And also you can, just a small vignette, I used to be CEO of Sustainability Victoria, and on my second day in the job, unfortunately a staff member had taken their own life, and it was a staff member that I had unfortunately had not met because I'd only been in the role 2 days. And so I had to get all the leaders in the room. I'd got the call from the police and from his dad, and tell them what had happened. I'm going to get emotional just talking about this. Anyway, I burst into tears, and afterwards, when I went back to my desk, I was so cross with myself, second day in the job, that I'd kind of hadn't been this strong leader and hadn't kind of held myself together giving this news. And then the response afterwards, everyone was like, she's a real person. And it was all positive feedback. So there is, even in women, we have all these structural biases about leadership style.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm getting the infamous stand up, wrap it up movement, which I appreciate. But I want to say, Claire, thank you for that vulnerability. And I think I'll just cap us off by saying, you know, I think it's really important that we don't give in to the red herring that this is, you know, men against women, or like this is, you know, a rigid gender thing. This is all of us against the patriarchy, right? Like, no one benefits from this system. Like, men are having a shit time, women are having a shit time, gender diverse folk are having a shit time. So, like, if we can just all come together and recognise that these systems aren't helping anyone, I think we'll achieve a lot more. And I think it's what all of you have touched on, is that, you know, this system's not working for any of us. So how do we disrupt it and how do we change it? But thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, team, for a beautiful final panel for our symposium. Some really honest reflections, diverse insights, and really grounded in reality, which is something that I personally deeply appreciated. So thank you so much, all of you. Can we give them a final round of applause? And you're welcome to stay, or you can return to your seats with them. And I think it is really fitting that we ended our symposium with a conversation around leadership, but also fitting that our last address will be from a leader that we've all been very impacted by.